Good afternoon and welcome to chapter 2 of this series of classes on the BBC from 1922 to 1995. And in chapter 1, I looked at I started with the question of what questions need to be asked about the history of the BBC, a very wide question, not a question with an easy answer. And I proposed to go through a series of currents of historical explanation, beginning with political history, which I've looked at, and I've also looked at cultural studies. And I'm going to continue with other currents of historical thought and what questions they might produce for us to apply to the history of the BBC. This is based around the conception of history that the most important thing that historians do is to find good questions. So one of the questions that Neil Postman comes up with this very negative view of television in this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, is what does it mean when a TV channel claims to be giving the people what they want? Who decides what people want? Are our desires controlled by the culture industry or by the media in general? And if they are partly controlled, how can we prove that this is true? How can we measure this kind of thing? But I'm going to continue with another approach to the history of the BBC, which would be institutional history. And institutional history is unavoidable as an approach to the history of the BBC. It would ask questions about who were the director generals, when and by whom were they nominated, what policies did they implement, what structures did they put in place, and how did this affect the final product, which are the programs. Now, Asa Briggs, a very renowned historian who is best known for his work on the Victorian age, undertook in the 1960s to write a history of the BBC, and he brought out 5 volumes of it, and this is the monumental history of UK broadcasting. And gave a lot of space for this current of institutional history. Although he did speak about other things too, it's nevertheless the case that he put a lot of emphasis on the influence that the leadership had within the institution. And perhaps we should look at who he is, because although he insisted that his history was not in any way an official history of the BBC, in the sense that nobody was telling him what to write, nevertheless, he was certainly chosen to write this history of the BBC, and given very broad access to the archives and to the inside story, if you like. Because he was considered to be a sympathizer, and indeed one of his books is dedicated to one chairman of the BBC, and another of his books is dedicated to another great leader of the BBC. So it's very much an insider's view, and although he does criticize the BBC, he's nevertheless has elements of an authorized history. His first volume, The Birth of Broadcasting, takes us through the 1920s in some detail, including the technical difficulties involved. And of course, when they began, they didn't know that they were inventing a form of mass communication, which would change the entire history of the century, and so sometimes they could underestimate what was going to happen next. So it took us through the 20s with the birth of broadcasting. The golden age of wireless is volume 2, and it takes us through the 30s up to the beginning of the Second World War, when the radio became a feature of millions of people's homes, and most people in the country discovered broadcasting in this period, and the BBC, who had the monopoly, had to invent a whole series of types of program and decide what they were doing with it, and also very much following the ideology and the approach of the leader, John Reith, and his certainly moralist view of what the wireless could do, but also this book does make a good job of showing the enchantment of everyday life that came from the radio, that it really was something which was new and which enriched people's lives tremendously. His third volume, The War of Words, 1939 to 1945, again is about radio, because although there was experimental television in 1936, 1937, 1938, broadcast almost completely in London to thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people, but no more. Once the war broke out, the television broadcasting was closed down, and they decided that radio was enough. However, radio played an enormous role in the galvanizing of civilian determination to win the war. Famously, of course, Churchill's broadcasts on the radio, and also had to deal with the question of how much propaganda is acceptable, how truthful should the BBC be, based on the two parallel truths. On the one hand, that the BBC was going to represent an official view, and on the other hand, if any radio recounts only the information which goes in the direction of the government, people quite soon end up not believing it anymore. Volume 4, Sound and Vision, then talks about the return of television in 1945 and the post-war boom, the beginnings of the post-war boom, when contrary to everybody's expectations, many people thought that the depression days of the 1930s would come back as soon as the war was over, and on the contrary, that Britain found itself in the biggest boom that capitalism had ever seen. And Sound and Vision, you can see each one of these volumes really pretty hefty, and it's fairly unlikely that you're going to manage to find the time to read them from beginning to end. So Sound and Vision, and again, they're all that invention when for 9 years after the war, the BBC had a monopoly on television in Britain, as well as a monopoly on radio. And furthermore, although radio could have some competition from foreign broadcasting, Radio Luxembourg, Radio Normandy, television did not seem to have, probably for technical reasons, did not seem to have any competition at all against the BBC in this period. And finally, volume 5, 55 to 74, you see, you didn't get any further than that, which is entitled Competition, and indeed from 1954, independent television or private television funded by advertising will be legal and very, very popular in the United Kingdom, and there will be an enormous public debate about the difference between them, the BBC and its public service, and the ITV and its slogan, "We give the people what they want," which of course is something which is difficult to define and to discuss. That was just to summarize those. Very, very briefly, of course, because Asa Briggs did put a lot of emphasis on the institutional history, and David Hendy, the present historian of the BBC, praised Briggs at the same time as pointing out that his was very much a top-down history, and some later attempts at the history of the BBC will take more of a bottom-up approach. There was one last thing I wanted to say about Briggs, but I don't know. I think it's just left me. Oh yes, the advantage then of institutional history is that you see the grammar of the production of television programs. It's not that the BBC is not a monolith which decides to show you this on Monday and this on Tuesday. It's a series of structures which creative teams then meet with and follow the rules or manage to find ways to avoid some of the rules some of the time. And the result is what we see on our screens. I'd just like to remind you here, I've done this before, I'll probably repeat it a few times, the weight of the television in the 60s, 70s and 80s, far more than today. Today, with Spotify and YouTube and Netflix and OCS and so on and so forth, there's a much wider choice. Whereas in the 70s, when you went into your works canteen or you went into your school playground, you could talk to people, and if they didn't watch ITV last night, they watched BBC. It was, did you see that program? And there was a very good chance that they had seen it, which is something which is no longer possible when you have a very, very wide choice. So going back to this institutional history of the BBC, one of the obvious elements to look at is the Director Generals. Apparently, it's possible to say Directors General, but I think almost everybody says Director Generals. Between 1927, when the BBC became a public corporation funded by the licence fee, and 1995, the end of the period of classic broadcasting and the beginning of the influence of the internet on BBC production, there were 12 Director Generals. So if we look at them, that will tell us something about the nature of the institution. The first thing we notice then is that they were all men, and indeed to date, in 2020, there has never been a woman Director General, which is obviously a fact of some importance. And we might think that each of the Director Generals would leave something of a personal imprint on the role. And certainly this was overwhelmingly true of the first one, John Reith, and here we have a painting of him. I've preferred a painting to a photograph because quite often a painting which is sat for shows the especially if it's sat for, that is not painted after his death, shows how the celebrity in question would like to be seen. And I think that there's obviously a very positive view of him, and you can see that there he is, alert, alive, not young, but alert, alive, and studying, working. And it's certainly true that he had a tremendous capacity for work, certainly an enormous sense of his own importance. He was said to have been thinking of, maybe perhaps I should be prime minister, perhaps I should be, he was one of these people who had a high idea of his own importance. But also he came along, obviously, to the BBC at a time when the rules had not been fixed and the traditions had not been fixed. And he was able to decide what public broadcasting should be. Now, when he began in 1922 with the British Broadcasting Company, it was a cartel of private companies. But from the beginning, he had an idea of public service. The private companies were to work together for a public service, and it was not too difficult to persuade the committees looking at broadcasting to officially move it into a public corporation, make it into a public corporation. In many ways, it was already a public service, even while it was technically private. So John Reith, what was he like, and what difference did that make? Well, his famously strict Presbyterian religious views had much to do with the principles he put forward, even though he did, of course, have to react to public and governmental pressure. Just like prime ministers, director generals do not do anything they feel like. They are very sensitive to pressures pushing them in different directions. Now, his personal opinion was nevertheless very important, whether it was a matter of deciding what kind of program was appropriate for a Sunday broadcast in what was still a very Christian country, or whether it was concerning the importance of recruiting women into significant roles. Clearly, his own personal opinion had significant weight. And just to go into those two things briefly, John Reith considered that on Sunday there should be no comedy, no popular music. This was the day of the Lord. During the periods when there would probably be religious ceremonies at church, there should be no programs at all. and indeed the rest of the time it should be pretty serious. And indeed, from 1928 to 1931, every Sunday, without exception, there was a Bach cantata played on the radio. Just to give you an idea, I don't know how much you know about Bach. Look it up on YouTube. So that's one side of it. Obviously, his personal influence is enormous there. Another Director General would not have insisted on that in the same way, even though this was devout Christianity was not as much a minority view as it is today. And the second example I wanted to mention was the question of recruiting women. Rather surprisingly for his generation, he was convinced that women could play an important role and do an excellent job in leading positions, and in particular, the first head of talks. A very important role in BBC radio was a woman, and what perhaps even more important, she was recruited by Reith. He went out to get her because he thought she was the best, and he brought her in. And I'm sure there must have been people saying, well, do we really want a woman? That was the kind of place it was. So interesting personal approach there, although the situation for women will get more difficult later on. Once, in particular, once in 1932, the marriage bar is established, which is to say that you may work for the BBC while you're single if you're a woman, but if you get married, you are expected to resign, and people did resign. In fact, practically all the women would resign when they got married for quite a long time. I don't have in mind the end of the marriage bar. It would be interesting. I will know it soon. Now, although later Director Generals each had their priorities, it is probably the case that they had less personal power, since the traditions of the job and the increasing numbers of committees dealing with one or other aspect of the workings of the BBC imposed more constraints. And indeed, John Reith was known to be, well, his critics said dictatorial, and his sympathizers said that he ran a tight ship. An institutional approach to the BBC then would put considerable emphasis on the dates and functions of various commissions and internal structures. Although the governance of such a corporation can be extremely complex and technical on an everyday basis, and there's plenty of room for accidental change, it's nevertheless clear that some of the institutional changes have a wider meaning. For example, in 1926, a new committee was established in the BBC, which was the BBC Advisory Committee on Spoken English. And this reflected the worries in educated and influential circles about the decline of proper English. This gentleman, Jörg Schweiter, has written a book about this, Dictating to the Mob: The History of the BBC Advisory Committee on Spoken English. And the title is intended to reflect some aspects of this activity, dictating to the mob. Now, it's a play on words, dictating, that is reading so that people can take notes, and dictating as a Hitler, as a dictatorship. And so dictating to the mob, yes, the mob's a very negative word, and the reason that he's put it in the title of his book is to reflect his opinion that the BBC leadership, the BBC elite, was looking down on the ordinary people, and they really only wanted people who had been to private education, of course, and been to Oxford preferably, and so on, and so forth. And indeed, the fact that the committee, which was suspended at the outbreak of the Second World War, was never reactivated after 1945 is extremely significant. Certain kinds of linguistic elitism were no longer acceptable as they had previously been. And this could be very strong. I remember reading a story about one of the high up people in the BBC hearing a Newcastle accent on the radio and reacting, "Get that horrible noise off my radio." Yes, this is really very strong level of class hatred, in fact. What does this mean? This means that institutional changes are often made under the pressure of social and political change, And in turn, that transforms the kind of program which can be created. Because it's true that after 1945, when the emphasis of government was the people have won the war and therefore the people must have more, free hospitals, social housing programs, free doctors, free dentists, more education, more free education, a higher leaving age, and so on and so forth, a move into a much more economically democratic society, the idea that the welfare state should care for people from the cradle to the grave, and this kind of new attitude of the elite, pushed by various motivations, which I won't go into right now, made it impossible for the BBC to continue with it. We don't want anybody with a Scottish accent on our programs. Thank you very much. It made it impossible. I have another example of institutional change, because we're still looking at the influence of an institutional approach to history. And this was the establishment in 1936 of the first audience research section at the BBC. This was a step backward for hardline Wrightianism, because, of course, the objective of an audience research is to check whether the radio is giving people what they want, or at least if people have this impression or not. And John Wright's general opinion was that people do not know what they want, and even less what they need. That's not an exact quote, but it's not far. It's a very clear idea that the job of the elite was to give people what was good for them, and not ask their opinion. And so Reith remained very skeptical about this idea of audience research. However, partly under the pressure, this was partly made under the pressure of competition from private radio abroad, Radio Luxembourg and Radio Normandy, which could be listened to in England, in most parts of England, and partly under a general pressure of the advance of the democratic spirit. So this institutional change, the introduction of audience research, reflected and caused other kinds of change. Very last example of the importance of institutional change, because the BBC does not automatically reflect social change. For example, obviously in the 70s and 80s, you got a rise in the possibilities for women to take up a whole series of public positions. The number of members of parliament who are women and so on and so forth was on the rise. The number of managers who was women was on the rise. However, these social changes do not automatically change the BBC, but they add pressure in a particular direction. But the last example I want to give you about institutional change is the transformation of BBC Radio. Sorry, that's the book on the history of the BBC audience research section. The last example I want to give you was the transformation of BBC Radio in 1967. A transformation which vastly raised the profile of popular music on public radio and introduced the DJ style and catchy jingles, which had previously been the preserve of non-UK commercial stations. And this institutional change, because Radio 1, Radio 2, Radio 3, Radio 4 replaced the old system of the home service and the light, the home program and the home service and the light program. This was the result of largely of outside pressure. Audiences wanted the all-day music and chirpiness that the recently banned pirate radio stations had provided, while traditional prejudice against popular music, which had prevailed in the circles of the BBC leadership, was weakening. So the new, the big reorganization in 1967 established Radio 1 as all-day pop music, Radio 2 as mostly music from the previous 30 years or so, Radio 3 as classical music essentially, and Radio 4 as intelligent speech, theatre, documentaries, comedy, and so on. And this is still a setup 1, 2, 3, 4, which is still in place today. So it's extremely long-lived. So you have the pressure from competition and from public demand, which leads to the reorganization in 1967, and the reorganization will then in itself produce new possibilities within the institution. Here we have, for example, then the set of Radio 1 presenters in 1967. And what you can see looking at this is one big change and one big non-change, if you like. One big change is look at how they are dressed. Okay, most of them are suits and ties. Look at their positions in photographed in informal positions. Some of them informally dressed with those what's the word, shirts and so on. Some of them allowed to have beards and so on. This is relatively informal for the time. They're looking chirpy. That's a reflection of a social change. And the other side of this, which is the reflection of a non-social change, which is to count the women. You have exactly 0 women. So it's not that they were pushed to the margins and women had a small role to play. There were actually none at all, which is something which is really quite impressive, if you like. I have one last example of institutional factors which intrude in the history of the BBC and are important to understand. And this is the adventure of the television series, The Wednesday Play. And the Wednesday Play series hit the headlines in the 1960s by broadcasting several radical plays on social issues on the television, such as Up the Junction, concerning illegal abortion, or Cathy Come Home, concerning poverty and homelessness in Britain at the time. Despite the boom and the fact that for most people their living standards were considerably higher than they had been, there was still homelessness and poverty around. And when we look at the memoirs of the producer of the Wednesday Play, I think there's made several dozen, perhaps more than 100 plays for Wednesday evening. The members of the producer, Tony Garnett, show clearly how, on the one hand, the structure of the BBC allowed a very wide leeway to producers. Producers were allowed to get on with their own job. They weren't interfered with, although if they did something that went too far, then it would come back and get them. And also, his memoirs show the power of the creative team, because they were very clever about how they dealt with management. So, for example, when they had a controversial play that they were going to put on, they would accidentally organize the management meeting on a day when they knew that the top manager was out of town and couldn't come to the meeting. Oh, he couldn't come to the meeting, so he wasn't able to give his opinion before this controversial play went out. So this is all these are all important elements to. There you have the one of the screenshots from Cathy Come Home, and one of the screenshots from up the junction. A wider view of the institution's history will place it within society in general. Now, the idea that the BBC has been run by a section of the social elite is not a controversial statement. When its first chairman decided to have his portrait painted in the 1920s, he sat for the painting with a sword and wearing white gloves, just to give you some sort of idea of the elite involved. In 1936, when the BBC were looking, as I mentioned, for a head of their new audience research section, the appointment was made by the elite co-option, which was typical of the time. Robert Silvery was invited to dinner at the London Gentlemen's Club, the Garrick Club. This is a club which is so conservative that even today in 2020, they do not admit women. The dinner was intended to test his character and perhaps find out what he had done in the war, the First War. Nobody mentioned the job, but because they were pleased with him, they phoned him up a few days later and offered him the job. This was the way that the elite found jobs for their friends, if you like. Going back to the Director Generals, let's look at the 12 Director Generals from our period. What can we learn about them? Well, 10 of them, 10 of the 12, were educated in private schools, whereas, in fact, less than 10% of the British population is educating in private schools, lower than in France because it's so much more expensive, private schools in Britain. So what are the questions the historian asks about this is what were the mechanisms that this elite functioned by? How and why did the elite become a little less closed as the years went by? And how did its general adhesion to the status quo affect the form and content of the programs? So you have the picture of Eton where some of the director generals went. So the strength of the institutional approach to British history, to BBC history, is it allows us to take into account the very specific characteristics of a very unusual organization, the nature of its tasks, the grammar of its experience. The weakness of institutional history is that it can become rather dry and bureaucratic as an account, like some popular histories of past countries, which are past centuries, which vastly overstate the influence of court intrigues on the world. And in particular, and a purely institutional history cannot explain certain central aspects of broadcasting, and in particular, the enchantment of everyday life, which I have spoken about. Briggs, in his history, often notes that early commentators on the arrival of radio in the home often spoke of the solace it could bring to the lonely, to the ill, or to the isolated, either as individuals, because of their life situation, or of communities, small villages lost out in the middle of nowhere. Rural life may have been transformed by radio more than urban life was. This wide window that radio gave on the world being more necessary. Briggs quotes an inside commentator from 1933 pointing out that the farther you get from London, the more broadcasting seems to mean. And perhaps the modern reader, because it's so unusual for us to have no media. And even if we spend a week without internet or the gramophone or the television or the radio, we find this to be a surprising experience, a challenge. So perhaps for us to imagine what radio meant to us, to the people in the 20s, we might need to imagine millions of women at home tasked with housework, which was far harsher than it is today, before most had vacuum cleaners, washing machines, before detergents had been invented, before supermarkets had been invented, before ready-made meals had been invented. In this situation, the radio might well appear then to be something of a miracle companion. And here we see a family from 1930 with their radio, and first the radio and then the television will very gradually displace, as the center of the living room will displace the fire, and this will be the object of the 20th century, and especially before the 60s, when there is no portable alternative. That's the end of chapter 2. There will be more. Thank you for listening.